In the spring of 1909, a small survey party climbed a windswept ridge in the high desert of northeastern Arizona and lowered a lantern into a chamber that had been sealed under the earth for centuries. What they saw down there was never fully written down, and within the same week, according to the story that has trailed this place ever since, they filled that chamber back in. They packed it with rubble and mortar, tamped the floor flat, and walked off the mesa as if nothing had happened. No report anyone can find, no catalogue, no photographs in any archive that will admit to holding them, just a hole in the ground on Antelope Mesa that was sealed twice in its life. Once by the people who built it, and once by the men who found it. The question that has haunted this story for over a century is almost embarrassingly simple. If they found nothing unusual down there, why did they close it so fast? Before we go any further, you need to understand where this happened. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Because the geography is doing more work than most people realize. Antelope Mesa sits in the Hopi country of northeastern Arizona, a long flat-topped shelf of sandstone rising above the Jedito Valley to about 5,600 feet. On top of it, and along its edges, are the ruins of ancestral Hopi villages. The largest of them is a place called Ahwatovie. At its height, Ahwatovie was one of the biggest and most important towns in the entire Hopi world, home to well over 1,000 people, with hundreds of rooms stacked into multi-story blocks and a network of underground ceremonial chambers beneath the plazas. People lived there for something like 500 years, and then, right around the year 1700, it ended in one of the most violent single nights in the recorded history of the Southwest. That part is not legend. That part is documented in Hopi oral history and confirmed in the ground by later archaeologists. After Spanish missionaries had established themselves at Ahwatovie and begun converting its people, leaders from the other Hopi villages decided the town had become a threat to everything they were. They came in the dark. They killed the men, scattered the women and children among the other mesas, and left Ahwatovie to the wind. It was never lived in again. So when you hear that Antelope Mesa is a place where things were sealed and abandoned and deliberately never reopened, that instinct is older than any 1909 survey. It is woven into the history of the mesa itself. Now hold that in your mind, because here is where the official record and the story part ways. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the American Southwest had become a hunting ground, not for animals, but for the past. Museums back east were in a race to fill their halls with artifacts, and a rough economy had grown up around the ruins. On one end were serious scientists. Jesse Walter Fuchs of the Smithsonian did some of the first systematic work at Ahwatovie in the 1890s. On the other end were pot hunters, men who would dynamite a wall to get at a room full of painted ceramics they could sell to a dealer in Santa Fe or Chicago. In between was a grey zone of surveyors, collectors, railroad men, and amateur expeditions, some of them well-funded, most of them poorly recorded, all of them moving fast because the money moved fast. And it was real money. This is the part people skip when they picture archaeology as patient men with soft brushes. By 1909, a good painted pot from the Southwest could be worth more than a labourer earned in a month, and a truly fine piece could fetch far more from the right buyer. The railroads had reached the region, and with them came tourists, dealers, and freight cars that could carry a crate of antiquities east in days. Museums in New York, Chicago, and Cambridge were not politely waiting their turn. They were competing, sometimes bitterly, to be the institution that held the definitive collection of a vanishing world. That competition set the incentives for everyone below them. If a museum would pay for artifacts, then someone would supply artifacts, and the fastest supplier was rarely the most careful one. Whole rooms were gutted for the objects that would sell, and the context, the boring layers of dirt that actually tell you what happened and when, was thrown aside as worthless. A century of that trade means the record we inherited is not a neutral record. It is a record shaped by what could be sold. And this is the world the 1,909 story lives in. As it is told, a survey party was working a stretch of Antelope Mesa away from the main Awatovi ruin, mapping smaller sites, when they broke into a kiva that had not been entered since it was closed by its own builders. A kiva, if you have never seen one, is a ceremonial room, usually dug down into the ground, entered by a ladder through a hole in the roof. It is not a basement. It is a sacred space, the spiritual center of a community. Some of them held painted murals so fine that when later archaeologists finally uncovered a set of them at Awatovi and the nearby village of Kawaika and the 1930s, professionals compared them to frescoes. These were not crude scratchings. This was a civilization painting its cosmos onto plaster walls, layer over layer, generation over generation. And that layering matters more than it sounds. When those murals were finally studied, researchers found that the walls had been replastered and repainted many times over, one image sealed beneath the next, like pages in a book that could only be read by peeling it apart. Some of the painted figures were later covered over deliberately, hidden by the very people who had made them, possibly when belief itself was under pressure. So the idea of a Hopi ceremonial chamber holding something painted, then sealed, then hidden from outside eyes, is not a wild invention at all. It is documented fact. The builders of these rooms already had a long, deliberate practice of covering things up, not to deceive the future, but because covering and uncovering was part of how they kept the sacred and the profane in their proper places. Keep that in mind, because it cuts in two directions at once. It makes the 1,909 story more plausible, and it makes the sinister reading of it far less certain. So the survey party goes down the ladder. And the story says that what their lantern showed them on those walls and on the floor did not fit. It did not match what a kiva was supposed to hold. And within days, before word could travel, the chamber was filled in and mortared shut. I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel does not run on fairy tales. There is no clean, stamped, official document that proves a survey crew sealed a specific kiva on Antelope Mesa in 1909. If there were, it would not be a mystery, it would be a museum exhibit. What we have instead is the shape of an absence. We have a place with a documented pattern of things being sealed. We have an era when records were sloppy and expeditions vanished from the paper trail all the time. And we have a story that has been passed along, retold, and reshaped for over 100 years, insisting that something came out of that ground that was never meant to be seen. The interesting question is not just whether the story is literally true. The interesting question is why this exact kind of story keeps happening in this exact place and this exact year. Because 1909 in Arizona was not a quiet year for buried secrets. Not by a long shot. Let me take you to the Grand Canyon. On the 5th of April, 1909, a newspaper called the Arizona Gazette ran a front-page story with a headline promising explorations in the Grand Canyon and mysteries being brought to light. The article described an explorer named G.E. Kincaid, who on a solo boat trip down the Colorado River had supposedly found the entrance to an enormous man-made cavern high in the canyon wall. Inside, the story claimed, was a vast underground citadel, hundreds of rooms, passageways running hundreds of feet into solid rock, copper tools hard enough to cut stone, hieroglyphic tablets, statues with an Eastern, almost Egyptian look, mummified remains, a dining hall said to seat thousands. And the whole excavation, the article claimed, was being financed and directed by the Smithsonian Institution under a professor named S.A. Jordan. It was an extraordinary claim. And here is the part that matters for our story. The Smithsonian, when asked about it over the following century, said it had no record of any Kincaid, no record of any Professor Jordan, and had never excavated any such site. Researchers who went looking could not find that either man had ever existed. No other newspaper picked the story up. The Arizona Gazette never printed a follow-up. By most sober accounts, it was a hoax, a piece of sensational yellow journalism from a paper that liked to sell copies with tall tales. But watch what the hoax does, because it tells you something about the machinery of these stories. It takes a real place. It attaches a real, trusted institution. It describes something that would rewrite the entire accepted history of the Americas, and then it seals the discovery off, out of reach, in a forbidden zone where no ordinary person can go and check. Denial, distance, and a locked door. That is the template. And once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it in the Antelope Mesa story either. So the skeptic and the believer end up staring at the same set of facts and walking away with opposite conclusions. The believer says, "Look at the pattern. 1909, Arizona. An underground chamber, an advanced people who do not fit the accepted timeline, and an authority that seals it and denies it." Two versions of the same event, one in the Grand Canyon and one on Antelope Mesa in the same year. That is not coincidence. That is a cover-up leaving fingerprints in two places at once. The skeptic says, "Look at the pattern. This is simply what a certain kind of story looks like." The Grand Canyon tale was invented to sell newspapers. The Antelope Mesa tale borrowed its shape from the same cultural moment. The reason the two stories rhyme is not that both are true. It is that both were built from the same parts. I am not going to pretend I can hand you the final answer in a video, but I can do something more useful. I can walk you through what each side actually believes was in that chamber and let you weigh it yourself. Because the theories are where this gets genuinely strange. This is where we cross into the territory that this channel exists to explore, the revisionist history of the world economy. The idea, held by a growing number of people online, that the story we have been handed about human progress is not just incomplete, but deliberately rearranged, and at the center of that movement is a single word: Tartaria. If you are new to this, here is the short version, told fairly, so you can judge it. The Tartaria idea starts from a real observation. On old maps, for centuries, a huge region of Central and Northern Asia was labeled Tartary, or Grand Tartary. It was a real cartographic term. Over the 1800s, that name quietly disappears from the maps, and the lands it covered get carved up and relabeled. To a mainstream historian, this is ordinary. Tartary was always a vague European catch-all for territory that Europeans did not know well, and as they learned more, they replaced the placeholder with real borders and real names. But to the revisionist, that erasure is the thread you pull. The claim goes that Tartary was not a vague label but a lost civilization, a vast, advanced, technologically sophisticated culture whose existence has been scrubbed from the accepted record. Its supposed evidence, the believers say, is all around us. Grand old buildings that seem too ornate, too massive, too perfectly engineered for the small populations and simple tools the history books assign to their era. Cathedrals and exposition halls and courthouses that were supposedly thrown up in a year or two by people who, we are told, had no advanced machinery. Star forts, ornamental ironwork, buildings partly buried in the ground, their first floors sunk below street level, as if a layer of earth had washed in over everything at once. That last part has its own name in this world: the mud flood. The claim that at some point, perhaps in the 1800s, a great flow of sediment buried the lower stories of cities across the globe, and that what we call the basements and cellars of old buildings are really their original ground floors, drowned in mud and quietly dug back out. And tied to all of it is the idea of a reset, the notion that history runs in cycles, that an advanced world was wiped out and buried, that the survivors either forgot or were made to forget, and that a new story was written on top of the old one to explain the ruins they inherited. Now, I want to be straight with you, because you deserve better than to be flattered. Mainstream historians and archaeologists reject almost every piece of this. They can show you the construction records for those grand buildings. They can explain sunken ground floors as ordinary changes in street grading and drainage. They can point out that Tartary was a name on a map, not a nation with a flag. The academic consensus is that Tartaria, as a lost super-civilization, is not real. But here is why the idea will not die, and why it matters for a chamber on Antelope Mesa. The Tartaria movement is not really an argument about Central Asia. It is an argument about trust. It is a way of asking a question that a lot of people feel in their bones and cannot shake. Who decides what counts as history? Who gets to say which ruins are ancient and important, and which ones get filled back in and forgotten? And who profits from the version we are told? That question has teeth, whether or not you believe a single word about mudfloods. And before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It lands harder now than it would have 20 years ago. We live in a moment when a lot of people have watched official stories get revised after the fact, watched experts contradict each other, watched institutions defend themselves first and explain themselves later. Once you have felt that a few times, a claim like the story we were told about the past is not the whole truth stops sounding paranoid and starts sounding like ordinary experience. The Tartaria movement is, in large part, that feeling looking for a shape to pour itself into. The buildings, the maps, the mud, they are the vocabulary. The real sentence underneath is simpler and much harder to dismiss. We are not sure we can trust the people who curate our past. And a sealed chamber on a remote mesa, closed by unknown men who left no record, is almost custom built to hold that suspicion. So let us bring it back to the mesa, and let us ask what the revisionist claim was actually down in that kiva. The strongest version of the story goes like this. When the survey party dropped into the chamber, they did not find the usual assemblage. They did not find the ordinary pottery and grinding stones and the sipapu, the small symbolic hole in the floor that represents the place of emergence in Puebloan belief. Instead, the story claims, they found masonry that was wrong, joints too tight, stone dressed too finely, cut with a precision that hand tools were not supposed to be able to achieve. Some tellings add strange symbols on the walls that did not match known Puebloan iconography. Others add objects made of metal in a culture that the textbooks say worked in stone, bone and clay, and a few tellings, the wildest ones, add remains. Bodies that were too large, or arranged too carefully, or simply too old to fit the accepted timeline of who lived on that mesa and when. To the revisionist, every one of those details points the same direction. It says that underneath the accepted story of the ancestral Puebloans, there was an older and more advanced layer. A remnant of the same buried, forgotten world that Tartaria is supposed to represent. And it says that when the survey party realized what they had stumbled into, they understood immediately that it could not be allowed to enter the record. Because a single chamber of impossibly advanced stonework, properly documented and studied, would not just add a footnote, it would crack the foundation of the entire timeline. And a great deal is built on that foundation. That is the theory. Now let me give the other side its full weight, because a fair look demands it, and because the ordinary explanation is not boring. It is actually its own kind of tragedy. Start with the ceiling itself. To someone who does not know Puebloan practice, filling in a chamber right after opening it looks like panic, like a cover-up, but kivas were sealed as a matter of course. When a kiva reached the end of its ceremonial life, it was often deliberately closed, sometimes burned, sometimes filled in, sometimes retired with ceremony. A sealed kiva is not evidence of a secret. It is evidence of a culture that treated these rooms as living things with a proper end. A survey crew that found a kiva already ritually closed by its builders, and then backfilled it to protect it, would be doing something completely normal for the region. And backfilling was standard practice for a second reason that has nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with survival. An open excavation on an exposed mesa is a wound. Wind, rain, frost, and above all, looters will destroy it within a few seasons. When the Peabody Museum of Harvard ran its major Awatovi expedition in the 1930s, one of the things they did with much of what they dug was fill it back in when they were done, not to hide it, to save it. Most of that famous excavation sits backfilled to this day. So the single most dramatic element of the 1909 story, the rapid sealing, is also the single most ordinary thing a competent crew could have done. Then there is the missing paperwork. To the believer, absent records mean suppression. But you have to understand how much simply was never written down, or was written down and lost. In 1909, on tribal land, with a patchwork of surveyors and collectors moving through, there was no requirement that every site be reported to anyone. Notebooks were lost. Expeditions folded. Men died, and their field notes went into an attic and then into a fire or a landfill. The Grand Canyon hoax proves the flip side of this too. Sometimes the reason you cannot find the record of an expedition is not that it was buried. It is that the expedition never existed in the first place, and someone made it up. And there is one more explanation, the hardest one, and I think the truest to the spirit of this place. Even if there was a real chamber, and even if a real crew really did open it and close it fast, the most likely reason has nothing to do with lost super-civilizations. It is that these were sacred Hopi spaces, and the fastest, quietest thing to do with a disturbed ancestral chamber, especially one that a crew had no permission to be in, was to close it back up and say nothing. Not to protect a global secret, to avoid trouble. The silence in the record might not be the silence of a conspiracy. It might be the silence of men who knew they had disturbed something they had no right to touch. That is a less thrilling answer, but it might be a more honest one. And notice that it still leaves you with a sealed chamber, a vanished record, and a story that refuses to die. The ordinary truth and the extraordinary legend both end at the same locked door. So why does any of this matter? Why spend 30 minutes on a hole in the Arizona desert that may never be found again? Because the fight over that chamber is a small, sharp version of a much bigger fight, and it is a fight about money and power as much as it is about the past. This is where the economic history comes in, and this is the part I most want you to sit with. Think about who benefits from the accepted story of the past, and what they would stand to lose if it changed. The version of history we inherit is not free. It is expensive to produce and expensive to defend. It is built by institutions, universities, museums, foundations, publishers, government agencies, and it supports careers, reputations, endowments, and entire industries. An artifact is not just a piece of the past. It is an asset. A dig is not just a search for knowledge. It is a claim staked on the ground, with funding attached and prestige riding on the outcome. Follow that thread into the present, and it only gets sharper. The global market in antiquities is worth billions, and it runs on scarcity and story. An object is valuable because it is rare, and because someone credible has certified what it is and where it belongs in the timeline. Change the timeline, and you change every price tag attached to it. A single find that reclassified an entire culture would not just rewrite a textbook chapter. It would ripple through collections, valuations, insurance, and the reputations of the people who authenticated everything around it. Value in this world is not just about what an object is. It is about the agreed story that surrounds it. And agreed stories are worth defending because a great many people have money and standing riding on them staying exactly as they are. Now imagine, hypothetically, that a single chamber turned up that genuinely did not fit. Not a fraud, not a misreading, but real evidence that the timeline was wrong in a fundamental way. Who eats the cost of that? Not the public. The public would find it thrilling. The cost lands on the people whose authority is built on the old story being correct. The revisionists are not entirely wrong about the incentive. There is a real structural reason that established institutions are slow to embrace anything that would overturn the framework they are built on. That is not a conspiracy. It is just how institutions behave when their foundations are threatened. They defend the foundation. And that is the genuine insight hiding inside a movement that gets a lot of its specific claims wrong. You do not need a secret society burying cities in mud to end up with a history that serves the powerful. You just need ordinary incentives, running quietly for a long time. You need funding that flows towards safe conclusions. You need a market that prices some artifacts as priceless and treats others as rubble to be backfilled. You need a story about who was advanced and who was primitive, a story that, conveniently, tended to place the people writing the textbooks at the top of the ladder. And here is the sharpest edge of it. the part that the Grand Canyon hoax accidentally revealed 100 years ago. Look again at what that 1909 article did. It took a real Native American landscape, one that had been lived in and shaped for thousands of years, and it erased the people who actually built it. It said the real story was Egyptians, or an Oriental race, anyone but the ancestral Puebloans standing right there in the historical record. Modern historians have pointed out exactly this. These lost civilization tales, the giants, the Egyptians, the Tartarians, almost always show up in places where an indigenous people already had a rich and documented history, and the tale quietly writes them out. The theory that claims to be uncovering suppressed history often ends up suppressing the real history that was never hidden in the first place. It was just ignored. So when the revisionist says the chamber on Antelope Mesa proves an advanced lost civilization was scrubbed from the record, there is a bitter irony sitting right underneath the claim. A civilization was scrubbed from the record on that mesa. The Hopi ancestors who built Awatavi, who painted those Kiva murals, who tracked the sun for 500 years to know exactly when to call the rains, who died in a single terrible night, around 1700, and were never allowed to come home. That is the buried civilization. It is not hidden. It is right there, largely off limits today, because the Hopi people themselves protect it as sacred ground. And it does not need Egyptians or Tartarians to make it extraordinary. It was already extraordinary. It was just filed under a heading that most of the world learned to skip past. That is the trap of this whole genre, and I want you to walk out of this video seeing it clearly. The hunger that drives the Tartaria movement is a real and reasonable hunger. It is the sense that we have been sold a flattened, sanitized, convenient version of the past, and that someone is profiting from our not looking too closely. That instinct is worth honoring. But the answer to a flattened history is not to invent a more exciting fake one. The answer is to look harder at the real one, including the parts that were backfilled and forgotten because no one with power thought they were worth keeping open. There is a strange comfort in a mystery that stays sealed. As long as the chamber is closed, it can hold anything you need it to hold. For the believer, it holds proof of a buried world. For the skeptic, it holds nothing but dirt and a good story. For the Hopi, it may hold something that was never anyone else's business to see. The moment it is opened and documented and explained, it can only be one of those things, and the other possibilities die. So there is a quiet incentive, felt by almost everyone for different reasons, to leave the door shut. That is worth noticing. Some doors stay closed not because a single villain is guarding them, but because too many people, on every side, would rather keep the question than lose it. So let us stand at the edge of that chamber one last time, whatever it really was, and ask what we actually know. We know Antelope Mesa is real, and that it holds one of the great lost cities of North America. We know that city ended in violence and was sealed by history long before any surveyor arrived. We know that in the years around 1909, this landscape was crawling with men digging for a past they could sell, and that record-keeping was so thin that entire expeditions could appear and vanish without a trace. We know that 1909 in Arizona produced at least one fully documented hoax about an advanced lost civilization hidden underground and covered up by a great institution. And we know that somewhere in that same time and place, a story took root that a survey crew opened a kiva, saw something that did not belong, and closed it within the week. What we do not know is what was on those walls. We do not have the notebook. We do not have the photographs. We do not have the names of the men who went down the ladder. The chamber, if it is still there at all, is somewhere under the sand of a mesa that outsiders are no longer free to walk. And so the story sits exactly where the Grand Canyon story sits, and where every story of this kind sits. Behind a locked door, in a forbidden zone, just out of reach, where belief costs nothing and proof is impossible. Maybe that is the real reason these stories never die. Not because they are true, and not because they are lies, but because they live in the one place we can never fully search. The gap between what was recorded and what was real. And on a mesa full of chambers that were sealed on purpose, by people who understood that some things are closed for a reason, that gap is very deep and very old and very quiet. Whatever they found on Antelope Mesa in 1909, if they found anything at all, They made a choice that people have made on that ground for 1,000 years. They covered it back over. They let the desert keep it. The mesa has kept harder secrets than this, and kept them longer. And they left the rest of us standing at the edge of the hole, holding a lantern, staring down into the dark, trying to decide what we are willing to believe.